Most cameras that you buy in the store come with a standard low-cost zoom lens, also called a kit lens. This lens works for everyday shooting during daylight, but the performance suffers at nighttime when low-light shooting is required. In addition, it limits the creative options. For example, one cannot do extreme wide-angle or long telephoto shots. At a bare minimum requirement, you should consider getting a fast 50mm prime if you don't already have one. This fast lens could be an f1.4 or f2 as compared to a zoom which might be an f5.6. The f5.6 is many times darker than an f1.4 or f2. The reason for the 50mm is that it is closest approximation to the view of the human eye. Shooting through a 50mm appears to people as they would view the environment. Now, I'm a big believer in the histogram to estimate exposure. The histogram can be used to gauge exposure. It can help you tweak your aperture in the right direction so as to record the proper exposure level. On the histogram, you should see a range of tones from left to right. Hopefully, you're exposing just right and you see a nice spread of tones throughout the entire range. However, if most of the tones are all in the dark area, the left, you want to check that you are not crushing the blacks. You can do this by ensuring that most of the tones are not grouped together on the left side, and then that they do not hit the left border and suddenly drop off straight down. If most of the tones are all in the light area, the right, then you want to check that you are not clipping the highlights or overexposing the highlights. You can do this by ensuring that most of the tones are not grouped together on the right side and that they do not hit the right border and suddenly drop straight down. This would imply that part of the tonal range is missing and has been clipped. With digital capture, you never want to reduce the detail or block out the detail from recording in such a harsh and drastic manner. The range should end before gradually as it reaches the sides. Make sure you adjust the aperture to get the look that you want, but at the same time, check out the histogram as it changes to confirm that you are at an acceptable level. In the top left image, we see that the tones on the right side are overexposed. The highlights can be seen to be too strong, and the shadows are missing. The tones are grouped towards the right and are clipped on the right side. In the bottom left image, the histogram is underexposed on the right side, and as for the left side, the tones are crushed. And lastly, in the bottom right image, this is an okay exposure. This histogram represents a nice range of tones. Ideally, you want the tones to be mostly even from left to right. However, this particular image has a bias towards the darker tones. Another important concept to be aware of has to do with exposure and depth of field. Many people who've never used a DSLR before wonder how that focused subject and soft background is achieved. A sharp, medium close-up with a soft background can look absolutely stunning. It's one of those indicators to the public that a professional must have filmed the project. Control over depth of field is what allows one to blur out the background while keeping the subject in focus. Well, the secret to the control of depth of field lies in the knowledge on how exposure is related to the depth of field. I will go over the subject in more detail later, but for now, I outline the settings that will help you achieve control over depth of field, or more specifically, a shallow depth of field. One factor is low light. If the scene is dark, you will use a low f-stop to open up the lens, which will produce a shallow depth of field. Another factor, ND filters. If the scene is bright, using a low f-stop is not possible, as it will overexpose the image. To be able to use a low f-stop, you will need an ND filter. The ND filter will block out some of the light from reaching the lens, allowing you to use a low f-stop, which will then produce a shallow depth of field. Long lens. Long lenses generally have a bit higher f-stop value than normal view or wide-angle lenses. Also, they compress distance. The view one gets from looking through a long lens is often one that separates the subject from the background. Another factor is fast shutter speed. The faster the shutter speed, the less time available to expose an image. The faster shutter will help to produce shallow depth of field. Another option is to decrease the sensitivity of the camera or to decrease the gain. This is an image that demonstrates selective focus and blur effect of shallow depth of field. There is a relationship between the aperture setting and the depth of field. If the lens is stopped down to a minimum aperture of f/16, then this setting will block most of the light from entering the camera. As a consequence, it will take a strong ambient light level in the scene to provide an adequate exposure. As for the depth of field, it will be deep, and pretty much a lot of the scene will be in focus. Now, if the lens aperture is set wide open, say an f2, then the light will have no problem to enter the camera. As a consequence, it will not take a strong light level to properly expose the scene. As for depth of field, in this instance, it will be shallow, and it will be possible to selectively focus within the scene. Remember, if there is not enough light, open up the aperture to add more lighting. If there is too much light, then avoid overexposure by either adding a neutral density filter or stopping down the lens. As you can see, you have two choices for either way you go, and the choice you make will affect your depth of field. Another important concept and really easy to master is called white balance. Digital cameras will not record an image the same way that the human eye perceives the image. The digital camera records both the objects in the scene and the lighting conditions present. By comparison, the human eye doesn't perceive the lighting conditions, but the eye adjusts to the lighting conditions to see the actual color. For example, if you stand near an incandescent light bulb with a white card, the white card will appear white to you despite the color cast that the light bulb may be emitting onto the white card. However, the camera will actually record the color cast on the white card. It will record the lighting condition present. Therefore, the camera must be tweaked to record only what the person would see if they were in that situation, and not to record the lighting conditions. White balance is the method through which the camera can adjust itself or be adjusted to produce an image that is realistic and free from color casts. As a result, the whites will appear as white. DSLR cameras have the option to white balance the shot either through an automatic method or through manual control. Though you can use the automatic white balance feature, it is much better to take control and manually white balance. This will ensure that you record in a controlled and consistent way, and it will give the best results. The first image has a reddish-orange color cast, and people can immediately pick up on this and recognize the color problem. They most likely assume it was recorded wrong, or that the editor was an amateur or intentionally produced it in post-production. The truth is, the white balance was not set up correctly in the shot, and the image was recorded with a color cast. This situation is fixable in post-production, and after a balance adjustment in the editing program, we can see white as white again and end up with the image on the right.